Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, for those of you who aren't Kelley students, welcome to the Kelley School of Business. My name is Bruce Jaffe. I'm the chair of the Department of Business Economics and Public Policy here in the Kelley School of Business. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce Sir Ivor Roberts, the president of Trinity College at Oxford, who is the 2010 Charles F. Bonser Distinguished Lecturer in Public Policy. Before I share with you some thoughts on Sir Ivor and his background, let me take this opportunity to say a few words about Chuck Bonser, for whom this lecture series is named. Chuck was a longtime member of the Indiana University faculty, first as a faculty member in what is now the Kelley School of Business, and a faculty member in my department, Business Economics and Public Policy. Chuck served as Associate Dean in the business school before being tapped by then President John Ryan in the 1970s to be the founding dean of a new academic unit on campus, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. That school's combination and integration of two fields, public policy and environmental studies, was the hallmark of Chuck's career and strategy. Using his charm and diplomatic skills, he was able to find synergies and opportunities among IU faculties and departments. Upon his retirement, he established this lecture series, a cooperative venture between Kelley and SPIA to bring to campus major figures in public policy. Showing that he had not forgotten his bargaining skills, he was able to negotiate that both SPIA and business would equally match his financial contribution to the lecture series. Chuck has continued to be active and to support cooperation between these units as well as other units on campus, and even after retirement, Chuck has served as director of the Arts Administration Program, which involves some of the arts departments and schools on campus, especially music and business and management. I've already mentioned diplomacy, and we were privileged today to welcome Sir Ivor Roberts to campus. Like the Beatles, Sir Ivor got his start in Liverpool. I'm not sure if he's going to sing or play for us, but as far as I know, their paths diverted. Sir Ivor was educated at St. Mary's College, Crosby, and at Keble College, Oxford. Upon graduation, he entered the diplomatic service, where he served his nation for more than 30 years. He served in a variety of hotspots in the world, both in temperature and in terms of political issues, in Spain, Lebanon, France, Luxembourg, Australia, and Vanuatu. He was ambassador in Belgrade in the 1970s. When was it? The 1990s. Time passes very quickly. Dublin and Rome. He retired from diplomatic service in 2006 when he became the president of Trinity College in Oxford. One of the best books, very detailed books on the Balkan situation in the 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s, is David Owen's Balkan Odyssey. The author describes his last days after a frustrating assignment that he had in what's now described as the former Yugoslavia. It's interesting to me to read that book, or reread that book, essentially in visiting Belgrade. He stopped by Sir Ivor, then Ivor Roberts' house to pay his farewells. And I think appropriately he described Sir Ivor as he had been a tower of strength and full of sense, with excellent access to Milosevic, which is not maybe the best character in the world, but the ability to have strength, sense, and access is absolutely important and a hallmark to Sir Ivor. So it's great my pleasure to introduce Sir Ivor and welcome him as the 2010 Bonser Lecturer in Public Policy.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bruce. It's a real pleasure to be here in Bloomington, my first, but not, I trust, my last visit to Indiana, and a signal honor to be asked to give the Charles F. Bonser Lecture. I've already enjoyed some of the legendary Hoosier hospitality, and I greatly look forward to this lecture and my other meetings on campus. Being entertained hospitably is a great thing. Sometimes, however, it can be dangerous. This tale was told of Stalin, no less, about a visit from a delegation from his home region of Georgia. Stalin was very charming, affable, hospitable. He filled the delegation with vodka and cakes. They stayed for some time, they talked to Stalin, then they go, heading off down the Kremlin's corridors. Stalin starts looking for his pipe. He can't find it. He calls in Beria, the dreaded head of the KGB. Go after the delegation and find out which one took my pipe, he says. Beria scuttles off down the corridor. 5 minutes later, Stalin, sorting through his papers, finds his pipe. He calls Beria. Look, he said, I've found my pipe. It's too late, Beria says. Half the delegation admitted they took your pipe, and the other half died under questioning. As Bruce has described, I had an earlier career as a diplomat. And when I was first appointed to the British Foreign Office, the Foreign Secretary, what you would call the Secretary of State at that time, was a Brown, same surname as our Prime Minister, but his name was George, not Gordon. And unlike our current Prime Minister, he was no ascetic Robespierre-like character. He liked his whiskey. And at a grand reception in Peru in 1968, George Brown, who'd had a whiskey or three on hearing the band strike up at this reception, tottered up to a figure resplendent in a fetching purple frock and slurringly asked the person for a dance. The figure turned him down on 3 counts, saying, "First, Mr. Brown, you are drunk. Second, this is not a waltz, it is the Peruvian national anthem. And third, I'm not a woman, I'm the Cardinal Archbishop of Lima." The celebrated National Security Advisor Zbig Brzezinski once remarked, if foreign ministries didn't already exist, they surely would not have to be invented. This leads to questions such as who needs diplomats or why bother with diplomacy? And to me, that's really a non-question, like one I saw advertised for debate last week in Oxford, was the 20th century a mistake? Empires and colonies have disappeared. The Russian Revolution has come and its effects largely gone at huge cost to mankind. But something of the threat from global ideologies remains. And while the territorial ambitions of many of the participants in the First World War now seem grotesque, the urge to expand territory and the determination to resist are still with us. Witness relatively recent events in Kuwait and Iraq and Palestine. But while the modern diplomat has to wrestle with these traditional problems of the relationships between states, he or she now has to address the modern problems, the horizontal problems of global jihadism, of nuclear proliferation, and of climate change, people trafficking and organized crime, the great financial crisis. And the diplomat attempts to deal with these problems in a way which creates the necessary conditions of peace, stability, and security, without which business cannot flourish. In the time available, I want to look at the origins of modern diplomacy before, during, and in the wake of the Versailles Peace Conference, the failure of the League of Nations, the beginnings of the United Nations and the Cold War, containment to détente. And then want to look at multilateral diplomacy, its summitry, modern diplomatic communications, paradiplomacy, and secret diplomacy. I hope to leave you with the impression that although events in the last decade may have pointed to the sidelining of diplomacy, it is as essential now to address the traditional and modern problems I've just outlined as it was when diplomacy began, however imperfectly, to put the pieces together at the Versailles Peace Conference. But let me begin by setting the scene as was in 1917. The balance of power which had generally kept the European peace for nearly a century had, as the 19th century came to a close, been replaced with a system of bipolar military alliances, uncannily mirroring the two power blocs that emerged with the Cold War. These alliances exposed Europe to the risk that a single incident could prompt a chain reaction leading to a general war. The rise of Prussian, then German militarism became the threat which by the end of the 19th century had entirely replaced a similar fear of French expansionism a century earlier. The system of alliances and the excessive weight given to military planning and timetables underlined any chance that diplomacy might head off what came to be seen as an almost inevitable clash. So along with the disappearance of old empires and much of the old order, the First World War also brought an end to old or orthodox diplomacy. The new diplomacy, which was to replace it, was usually vaguely defined, but was clearly predicated on a new openness born of faster communications, the increasing power of the press, and a shift in the balance of forces in the democracies from the ruling elites to the governed. Both before and during the First World War, there were repeated calls for diplomacy to be made more open and more accessible to public scrutiny and appraisal. As the cost of the war in terms of millions of dead became clear, and as its origins were seen to lie in the failure of the old diplomacy, so the requirement for a new approach became more insistent. The clamour was heard for open covenants openly arrived at, in President Woodrow Wilson's much-quoted words. It was natural that electorates claiming to control governments should require to know what agreements were being made in their name and to exercise the constitutional right of accepting or rejecting them, as indeed when the United States Senate in 1919 rejected participation in the League of Nations. The problem is that if negotiation is carried out under the public eye, as President Wilson at first appeared to think it should be, it quickly turns into a travesty of efficient procedure and runs the risk of betraying any constructive purpose for which it may have been conceived. If exhibited, it degenerates into polemic, and this is not diplomacy. Indeed, when Wilson came to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, he clearly abandoned this transparency, which was the first of his celebrated 14 points, America's war aims formulated by Wilson before Congress in January 1918. And Wilson maintained confidentiality even from lesser allies. All the key decisions were taken by the triumvirate of Wilson, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and the French President Clemenceau, with the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, the largely ineffective other member of the key body, the Council of Four, who paid scant regard to the views of others. The failings of the Treaty of Versailles have been discussed exhaustively, and this is not the place to rehearse them further. But in one area at least, it provided the germ of an idea which after a false start would take root. The new diplomacy had, beyond its requirement for openness, a yearning for an international organization to settle disputes and deter those who sought to impose their will by force. In its faltering steps towards world government, the League of Nations, the Versailles Conference changed the nature of diplomacy decisively, even if it took another world war before this became apparent. The League of Nations was first proposed, ironically given Britain's obsession hitherto with balance of power politics, by the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, to President Wilson's personal advisor, Colonel House, as far back as 1915. Wilson made the idea his own and presented it first in May 1916. It then, as I said, became one of his 14 points, and Wilson pursued the idea at Versailles with characteristic eloquence and vigour. But the League was emasculated by the US failure to ratify the treaty and by the non-participation of Germany, excluded till 1926, and then withdrawing under Hitler in 1933, and the non-participation of Soviet Russia, which was a member only for the years 1934 to 1939, when it was expelled. The League's limitations were demonstrated by its failure to impose sanctions on Japan in 1931 after its invasion of Manchuria, its response to Haile Selassie's famously pathetic and personal plea to the League for justice and assistance, and its failure to act when Hitler occupied the Rhineland in direct contravention of the Versailles Treaty. Collective security, the very purpose of the League, was hopelessly undermined. The failure of the League to prevent the slide into the Second World War, as Hitler and Mussolini treated it with rank contempt, marked the temporary eclipse of the new diplomacy. The alliances and pacts, the territorial acquisitiveness, the suppression of self-determination, all features of the old diplomacy returned with a vengeance. Once the Second World War was over, however, there was a clearly recognized need to create a new international organization to replace the League and to be significantly different in its basic design. The shape of the post-war world was, as we know, however, not set by a world forum, but by a series of summit meetings of the three Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill at Tehran and Yalta, and of Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, then Attlee, at Potsdam. Churchill foresaw that Stalin, the ultimate apostle of realpolitik, would never trade the Red Army's gains for abstract principles, and he proposed instead that each of the Allies should have its sphere of influence. This was anathema to Roosevelt as a return to discredited balance of power and colonial politics, which US public opinion would never support. Roosevelt famously described Stalin as having something of a Christian gentleman about him, but he didn't live to see the final unmasking of Stalin's bad faith as he took his sphere of influence, the whole of Eastern Europe and Germany to the Elbe. Thus, until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, new and old diplomacy coexisted. East and West were grouped in two mutually antagonistic alliances, while a new world body, the United Nations, struggled to fulfill its potential. The West attempted to deal with the Soviet Empire and Communist China by a policy of containment. Containment lasted 40 years. As a policy, it was first articulated by the celebrated American diplomat George Kennan. In what became known as the Long Telegram, Kennan brilliantly analyzed Soviet motives and political perspective. They were, he said, an unholy combination of communist ideology, traditional Russian insecurity, and Tsarist expansionism. To deal with this threat, he said, the West needed a policy of firm containment designed to confront the Russians with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. But containment was very much a policy for the long haul, reactive and predicated on the eventual collapse or transformation of the Soviet system. The communist threat was not, of course, monolithic. When the US began to take advantage of the ideological splits between the two communist mammoths, the Soviet Union and China, in the early 1970s, President Nixon demonstrated his attachment to old balance of power politics by daringly opening up US contacts with communist China and providing a triangularity among the three major nuclear powers which had hitherto been absent. At the same time, Nixon initiated the policy of détente with the Soviet Union. For Kissinger, the architect of this and so many other aspects of Nixon's foreign policy, détente, desirable though it was, could not replace the overall balance of power. In other words, it flowed from equilibrium and was not a substitute for it. This Sino-Soviet-US geostrategic triangle, with the US in preeminent position, was precisely the kind of policy for which Kissinger had praised Metternich and Bismarck in his earlier academic writings. In fact, while Kissinger's conceptual approach to diplomacy was traditional, his practice was highly innovative. Given the limitations of 19th century means of transport, neither Metternich nor Bismarck would have been able to follow Kissinger's practice of diplomacy, even if they'd wanted to. But Kissinger's uses of back-channel and shuttle diplomacy were remarkable. As an academic, he'd always been allergic to bureaucracy. His and Nixon's institutions of back channels early on in the latter's presidency stemmed from the need for secrecy, both to prevent their radical foreign policy initiatives being undermined by State Department leaks, and to ensure that opposition to his enthusiasm for linkage, negotiating on a broad front, was stymied. Kissinger himself put it more prosaically. He claimed that his use of back channels was designed to open up potentially blocked channels without completely sidelining the State Department. Once the back channels gave hope of specific agreements, the subject was moved to conventional channels. If these channels reached a deadlock, his back channel would open up again. Kissinger used back channel or secret diplomacy extensively in his time as US National Security Advisor, initially to implement the policy of détente with the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrinin. Later, he used a back channel with Lee Duc-to of North Vietnam in an attempt to bring the Vietnam War to an end. Kissinger added a new word to the diplomatic lexicon in being an early proponent of shuttle diplomacy, whereby the intermediary in a conflict shuttles backwards and forwards repeatedly between the parties in conflict or in dispute to secure the desired result. Of course, this type of diplomacy is not guaranteed to succeed, as General Alexander Haig found when attempting to mediate between Argentina and Britain during the Falklands War in 1982. But Kissinger's style and energy often secured results, on occasions because he had literally worn down the resistance of the opposing sides. Although Kissinger's theory and practice of diplomacy were highly individualistic and born partly out of impatience with traditional bureaucratic diplomacy, another form of diplomacy has flourished in the post-Second World War period. The multilateral approach has become increasingly common post-1945, but it had its roots in antiquity. In an attempt to stop the feuding and warfare, the principal powers in the Eastern Mediterranean, i.e. the important Greek states and Persia, agreed to convene great international political congresses to discuss a general settlement of outstanding issues. This general peace, known as the King's Peace, involved 8 congresses between 392 and 367 BC, and not only established a territorial stalemate with guarantees against an aggressor, similar to those which later figured in the Covenant of the League of Nations. They also agreed on certain general principles and on detailed practical rules of conduct for regulating international affairs. But in modern times, large-scale conferences took place infrequently. There was, of course, the examples of Vienna and Berlin in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the Versailles Conference set a precedent which has been followed ever more frequently since the Second World War, despite the view of some skeptics who see such conferences as largely talking shops. The celebrated early 20th century diplomat Paul Cambon believed that a conference which includes more than 4 or 5 people can achieve nothing worthwhile. This view has its adherents, but there can clearly be advantages to a multilateral conference in terms of efficiency and speed of decision-making. This doesn't necessarily apply to a standing multilateral conference like the UN or other international organizations which are not time-limited. But a conference will almost certainly be the best forum for decision-making and reaching agreements where, It has a deadline, is subject-specific, and/or where technical details are involved and the national experts are all assembled in one place. Such conferences also provide an opportunity for principals to meet in the margins to discuss other issues, including bilateral ones, a particularly valuable opportunity for those states which have no or very poor diplomatic relations. They can also kickstart a series of essentially bilateral negotiations that subsequently develop elsewhere. This was the extremely valuable function performed for the Arab-Israeli bilateral talks by the Geneva Conference of December 1973 and by the Madrid Conference in October 1991. The proliferation of international and regional organizations, so prevalent in the 1960s and 70s, partly a function of the greatly increased number of independent states who saw in these organizations an opportunity for exerting influence, has leveled off now. But multilateral diplomacy's advantages will ensure that it survives, despite the frequent echoes of Paul Cambon's put-down and abject failures like the recent Copenhagen Climate Change Summit. Both bilateral and multilateral diplomacy can be, and frequently are, carried out at the highest, that is to say, at summit level. An important definition is they are meetings between those who, by virtue of their position, are not able to be contradicted by any other individual. The word summit itself was first used to describe meetings at this level in a speech in 1950 by Winston Churchill, a parley at the summit. But the practice, like multilateral diplomacy itself, has ancient roots. In the Middle Ages, most diplomacy was carried out at summit level, often by kings and princes of neighboring states. But as the practice of resident diplomats became established in Renaissance Italy in the 16th century, so summitry went into relative decline. The practice enjoyed a renaissance in the 19th century and underwent a resurgence after 1914, fostered by the democratization of diplomacy and the belief that issues of war and peace were too important to be left to professionals. The speed of international travel has seen the practice mushroom in the last 30 years. For some, this has been the end of diplomacy, as the makers of foreign policy take it upon themselves to be the executors of it. But that is a superficial assessment to which we shall return. Summits, as originally conceived by Churchill, were infrequent and involved only a handful of the most important people on the planet. The practice is now so widespread that it's possible to identify different types. The first category is the serial summit, which is part of a regular institutionalized series, examples of which are the G7, G8, and now the G20 meetings, meetings of ASEAN, the Organization of American States, Arab League, European Union, Commonwealth, Franco-German summits. As can be seen, many of these are linked to international organizations and can constitute a court of highest appeal when disagreements between members cannot be resolved at a lower level. The second type of summit is an ad hoc summit, often set up to deal with a crisis, the Kyoto and Copenhagen summits on climate change, for example, or to break the ice between states whose relations have been poor or non-existent. Nixon's meeting with Mao in Beijing in 1972 is a good example of the latter. Although the substance is often important, the symbolism of the meeting itself may be even more significant, and it will undoubtedly tend to attract more publicity than a serial summit. The last kind is the high-level exchange of views. This least ambitious type of summitry is nevertheless extensively used, particularly by leaders undertaking a tour of a region. They may hope to get to know their opposite number, however superficially, and may be able to advance some issues which have been blocked. The dangers of summitry are not always appreciated by its practitioners. Being high-profile events, expectations of them are often raised and the risk of failure greater. As Dean Acheson, the former US Secretary of State, said, "When a chief of state makes a fumble, the goal line is open behind him." Personal chemistry may work to make the occasion a success, but if the chemistry works to repel rather than attract, the results will at best be meagre and the process best left to the diplomat to pursue. Sometimes they can be dominated by ceremonial and appear to be more exercises in publicity seeking, all froth and no substance, than breakthroughs in diplomatic negotiations. The most successful summits are those which have been meticulously prepared, a requirement where the professional, the diplomat, can be expected to come into his own. Whatever their shortcomings, summits and the accompanying media circus are now a permanent feature of diplomatic topography. The diplomat must learn to exploit a summit as an opportunity to buttress his own efforts and not to view it as an occasion which will diminish his own authority. If the speed of international air travel has had a major impact on the diplomat, the speed of international communications has been equally significant. The advent of the fax, internet, email, video or telephone conferencing, blogging, other forms of information technology transformed the means of diplomacy. A busy Foreign Service officer in an embassy will often prefer to email or even text his key contacts in host government departments to ascertain their views as rapidly as possible and without having to visit the ministry concerned. A sensible Foreign Service officer will use this approach when eliciting factual information. And officials in government departments now regularly communicate by telephone or other electronic means directly with their opposite numbers in other capitals, bypassing the embassy. This is now a fact of life, and given the specialization increasingly required to discuss issues like climate change internationally, it clearly makes sense for the experts to communicate directly and ensure that the foreign ministry or embassy is kept informed. It's not a question of courtesy to inform the embassy of the substance of the exchange. The well-informed diplomat will be best placed to put the information received into a broader political context. An example might be where he or she needed to remind the official in his home capital that the official with whom they've been communicating is a political appointee whose career is closely linked to his soon-to-be departing minister. When I started diplomacy, transatlantic conversations were rare. I'm reminded of the story from the 1940s when Molotov was the Soviet foreign minister. He was a shrewd man and a hard bargainer, but worked for Stalin. He was once overheard talking to Stalin by transatlantic telephone during the course of some very intricate negotiations with the West. He said, "Yes, Comrade Stalin," in quiet tones. Then again, "Yes, Comrade Stalin." And then after a considerable wait, "Certainly, Comrade Stalin." Suddenly he was galvanized into emotion. "No, Comrade Stalin," he barked. "No, that's no, definitely no, 1,000 times no." After a while he quietened down and it was, "Yes, Comrade Stalin," again. The reporter who overheard this was probably never so excited in his life. Clearly Molotov was daring to oppose the dictator on at least one point, and it would surely be a scoop of massive proportions if he could find out what it was. The reporter approached Molotov as calmly as he could. "Secretary Molotov," he said, I couldn't help but hear you say at one point, 'No, Comrade Stalin.'" Molotov turned his cold eyes on the reporter and said, "What of it?" "May I ask," said the reporter cautiously, "what the subject under discussion was at the time?" "You may," said Molotov. "Comrade Stalin asked me if there was anything which he had said with which I disagreed." Nowadays, heads of state or government often speak directly, with or without a video dimension, by secure telephone to discuss and resolve major issues. In the early days of hotlines between, say, Washington and Moscow, or Washington and London, this was seen as a diplomatic weapon of last resort. These days, such exchanges are routine. Foreign ministers will often speak to each other by such means several times a day during a crisis. In Western capitals, such conversations are recorded and a note prepared by a private secretary to inform those who need to know of the main points agreed or disagreed. This is essential, as an ambassador who's ignorant of the exchanges between his government and his host government at the highest levels cannot be expected to execute his mission effectively. While prime ministers, presidents, foreign and other ministers regularly interact as described above, there's another kind of activity which is essentially the antithesis of diplomacy, namely megaphone diplomacy. This is often the product of domestic political needs, where politicians feel the need for their own domestic political purposes to talk toughly and even roughly, even when it will damage their longer-term aims. It's often the diplomat on the ground who has to attempt to repair the damage done by resorting to megaphone diplomacy. If a diplomat no longer has a controlling monopoly in carrying out diplomatic tasks, part of the competition now comes not just from presidents, prime ministers, and other ministers in terms of direct contact with the leaders of the country to which he's accredited, but from others like non-governmental organizations, NGOs, humanitarian organizations, religious institutions, academics, former government officials and bodies like the Carter Center, and think tanks, among others. NGOs come in many shapes and sizes. Their objectives will be focused and invariably single-minded, less able or willing to take into account other aspects. As a result, their relationship with governments, although sometimes harmonious, may be one of tension and occasionally confrontation. Whereas an NGO will usually have a bias in favor of bringing matters into the open, a government has to balance out all the interests involved and is generally predisposed to favor confidentiality and discretion to avoid embarrassment to itself or damage to its relations with other governments. Increasingly, NGOs scrutinize and criticize the performance of government, and indeed a few NGOs will be active in the diplomatic field, sometimes duplicating, often monitoring the performance of governments and international or national organizations. Why have NGOs been able to move into a field which was for centuries the monopoly of a politico-diplomatic class? Well, one of the consequences of globalization, with its speed of communication and easy access to information for all, has been to weaken states' monopoly on diplomacy. This has led to a parallel growth in so-called Track 2 diplomacy, carried out either by private individuals or NGOs, a form of diplomacy which has increased exponentially over recent decades. The rise in importance of such bodies is partly a function of the way foreign policy, particularly among Western governments, is now less vertical, as I said at the outset, and more horizontal in its interests. In other words, governments pay increasing attention to issues like human rights and climate change, terrorism and nonproliferation, rather than the purely territorial or geographical issues which were the traditional stuff of diplomacy. It's also partly a question of the spread of literacy, the generation gap and counterculture of the 1960s, and the popularity of pressure group politics. NGOs in countries with non-democratic or authoritarian regimes seek to influence government policies to reflect the people's needs, rather than what they regard as merely the wishes of the ruling elite. The relationship between NGOs and governments is therefore a complex and often symbiotic one, which can to some degree compromise the former's independence. As has been said, if civil society becomes state-sponsored, it ceases to be civil, and NGOs become quangos. But increasingly, governments see the advantage of working with NGOs, particularly where their objectives match those of government. It's now common for NGOs, for instance, to be involved in preparations for international conferences. The UN and its agencies are increasingly open to some form of participation by NGOs in conferences under their aegis. Moreover, we now increasingly see the inclusion of NGO experts in government delegations. The rationale of governments which include NGO representatives as part of their delegations may, the cynic may say, have both domestic and foreign policy roots. It may be, at least in part, to mute domestic criticism of a particular policy. For conventional diplomats, Track 1 diplomats, there are advantages to working constructively with NGOs. These include obtaining good information and avoiding criticism for non-cooperation. There's one other kind of diplomacy I should mention, which is paradiplomacy, which involves actors from subnational or sub-state bodies, such as the Canadian provinces, the Australian states, the Basque Country, Catalonia in Spain, or the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish executives in the United Kingdom. I've already touched on back-channel or secret diplomacy in relation to the negotiations to bring the Vietnam War to an end. Another example was the secret negotiation over the Oslo Accords in 1993. In 1992, after a Middle East peace conference in Madrid had made limited progress, a series of secret meetings took place in Oslo, which was then taken over by senior officials sent by the then Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, now President Shimon Peres. The two delegations usually shared accommodation and meals, while the Norwegian government dealt with the logistics and kept the meetings confidential, even providing a cover through the Norwegian Institute for Applied International Studies. In both cases, conventional diplomacy was in some respects acting as a front for the real negotiations. Back-channel diplomacy, another phrase for secret diplomacy, was used in helping to bring the violence and troubles in Northern Ireland to an end. Since 1973, a Northern Irish businessman with strong links to the IRA and Michael Oatley, his MI6 case officer, had maintained a channel of communication between the IRA leadership and 10 Downing Street. It's very hard for democratic governments to admit to talking to terrorist groups while those groups are still killing innocent people. But luckily for this process, the British government's back channel to the provisional IRA had been in existence whenever required from 1973 onwards. In other words, one of the advantages of back-channel diplomacy is precisely its deniability, particularly appropriate when the other party is neither another government nor even an NGO, while another is the ability to talk to those with whom it's official policy not to engage in negotiation. There are, of course, disadvantages, but principally the irritation caused to those who are the visible face of the diplomatic process, and these are often the same people who have to implement any agreement reached via the back channel. Given their spiritual and humanitarian concerns, it's not surprising that religious bodies have been active in international relations for many years, even for centuries, like the Quakers. The community of Sant'Egidio, which began in 1968 as a Roman Catholic lay organization focused on the poor of Rome, has since spread to be represented in 70 countries and has been active in bringing an end to the civil war in Mozambique and in mediation and conflict resolution in Lebanon, Algeria, Albania, Guatemala, and Kosovo. Another recent manifestation of this Track 2 diplomacy has been the emergence of specialist consultancies on security matters that not only offer their business-orientated political analysis to companies and, on occasion, governments, but will also mediate in areas where governments fear to tread. Specialist risk consultancies have emerged, engaging in such activities as negotiating ransoms for kidnapped businessmen, which have gone against the policies of most Western governments which refuse to pay ransoms, and in some cases make doing so illegal. If the diplomat has to compete in such a busy marketplace, has the role of a diplomat been superseded or rendered superfluous? Certainly, if the marketplace of diplomacy has become busy, it's also expanded. The 60s and 70s saw a growth linked to the decolonization process, but the collapse of communism and the continuing vigor of nationalism also gave rise to a substantial expansion in the numbers of independent states in the last 20 years. No independent state feels it has truly reached that status unless it has a network of diplomatic missions to fly its flag in foreign countries and at the United Nations. The growth of international organizations and the need to staff them has also contributed, as has the broadening of many embassies' remit to take in work in economic and trade spheres, while traditional consular work has had to deal with an exponential growth in world tourism and immigration. While summitry has on occasions displaced the ambassador from prime position, even the most energetic leader can't be in two or more places at once. Prime ministers and special envoys relied on ambassadors to pave the way for successful visits abroad, just as foreign ministers needed embassies to keep them informed about other countries' negotiating positions ahead of talks. A distinguished British diplomat, Christopher Ewart Biggs, who was assassinated in Dublin by the IRA, wrote of the Paris embassy's support for a European Union summit, "One doesn't reach the summit without a base camp. The base camp was this embassy. It's the modern diplomat's task to man that base camp and occasionally perhaps to bask in the reflected glory of those who reach the summit." I happen to agree with Brzezinski that a world without diplomats would be an improvement, but that would be a world I don't recognize. No wars to end, no conflicts to prevent, no nuclear proliferation threats, no terrorism, no tourists losing their passports or ending up in prison, a world of perfect free trade and all countries so prosperous that development aid wasn't necessary. I don't believe that world is on offer. The world I inhabited as a diplomat was fraught with problems that left one like the mythological character Sisyphus, constantly pushing his boulder uphill. As far ahead as I can see, with the threats from nuclear non-proliferation, climate change, international terrorism, crime and people trafficking, now piracy again, global financial crisis, widespread poverty, and the consequent impact on illegal immigration and pandemics, diplomacy will not be underemployed. And it must make sense to put relatively modest amounts of money into preventative diplomacy and conflict resolution than to expend billions on military missions and billions more on reconstruction efforts after the fog of war has cleared. So while there's less glamour than in diplomacy of old, there's no lack of vital and fulfilling tasks to execute. Thank you very much.
Have time for questions or comments?
A very elegant presentation, sweeping analysis, which I enjoyed very much. I do have a question, though, about the relevance of diplomacy with certain actors. Al-Qaeda. Diplomacy requires at least an acceptance of certain rules. In some cases now, we're dealing with a world where the only solution is the annihilation of one of the partners, potentially. And these are perhaps our most pressing and urgent issues to deal with. And I wonder how you perceive of this changed environment. See, I recall with interest, Northern Ireland, even at the worst, you could still have a dialogue. And some of the African cases with guerrilla warfare, there were always certain rules. And I wonder if the rules continue to apply in the current context with these organizations.
Well, it's a very interesting question and a very difficult one to answer comprehensively. Traditionally, terrorism has been rooted in geopolitical, in a geopolitical context. Usually, someone wants territory for themselves, whether it's Northern Ireland or the Basque terrorist group in Spain, or in Sendero Luminoso in Peru. People want to acquire power, acquire control over a territory. Now, you could say that Al-Qaeda similarly are motivated by geopolitical instincts, except that their demands are so outrageous and so extreme that, as you say, it's very difficult to negotiate with them. Although I see, by the way, that their soul brothers, the Taliban, are now regularly cited as people with whom one should not only negotiate but bring into government. So all things are possible. But when you have a group like Al-Qaeda, who at one level are talking about the restoration of the caliphate, which would take in large chunks of Europe for a start, and most of North Africa, you are clearly dealing with a very difficult animal to fit into any previous context. But there is a serious job for a diplomat to do in addressing some of the underlying grievances which allowed Al-Qaeda to develop and continue to attract support. One of those is the Palestinian question, which has been the throughout my professional life. I started as a diplomat in 1968. Has been the single festering, most festering sore, if you can have a most festering sore, and one in which we've made remarkably little progress. Some might say that we're further away from an agreement than ever. Certainly the events of the last week have not been very encouraging. In fact, what is encouraging at one level is that now most people can see what the solution to the Palestinian question is, which is the two-state solution, which has now been endorsed by most normal people. I exclude people like the president of Iran, who is on record as wanting to see the destruction of the state of Israel. But if you're talking about reasonable actors in the region, the area, there is an end solution. But how we get there and the difficulties of what is now clearly going to involve trading pieces of land where I don't think anyone realistically believes one will go back to the pre-1967 borders, but that doesn't mean that one party, Israel, can simply camp on the territorial acquisitions of that at the time of that war. They will have to trade land in terms of their own security. But all these things are possible. The climate of mutual trust that is required has now been broken, and I suspect it'll be quite a while before we get back into serious negotiations, and not helped by the fact that the Palestinian leadership is A, so weak, and B, so hopelessly divided, quite literally into two separate camps. But a solution to that problem would, I believe, go a long way to undermining support for Al-Qaeda and allowing them to attract continuing recruits from different parts of the Arab and Muslim world. Yes?
You referred to Iran, and we often hear in relation to negotiations with Iran the warning about another Munich. I wonder whether you would comment on the appropriateness of that analogy and speak of what kind of negotiation or diplomacy you think may be possible, not only with Iran, but in dealing with the issue of nuclear nonproliferation.
Yeah. Munich has become a kind of convenient shorthand for any negotiation where one party thinks that unnecessary concessions are being made to another. And in a sense, you could say that all diplomacy is a form of appeasement. Appeasement has had a very bad press for the last 72 years, I think. But I don't want to write a sort of paean of praise for appeasement, but what I do want is to try and restore a sense of balance to the word, to try and appease two people's, both sides, unreasonable demands, and to try and find a common meeting ground between them seems to me the substance of diplomacy, and infinitely preferable to fighting long, costly wars. Iran, one of the unintended consequences of the war in Iraq has been to make Iran a regional superpower. And I'm sure that nobody in this country set out with that idea in mind, but that is where we are today. And that is a very dangerous situation. There is no regional power which is capable of counterbalancing Iran's local interests. And if you're a regional superpower, if you can think yourself into the mind not of an extremist like President Ahmadinejad, but an ordinary Iranian with a great sense of their own history, which after all goes back thousands of years, and when they were genuinely a world power. And if you look around you to your neighbours and near neighbours, you look at Pakistan and India and Israel. These are all countries which have nuclear weapons. Iraq undoubtedly at some stage was trying to manufacture a nuclear weapon. Even a tin pot country like Libya was trying to manufacture nuclear weapons. Why are we, Iranians, one of the great historical powers in the world, not denied the right to even exploit nuclear energy? I mean, it is something which I think very much goes to the hearts and minds of ordinary Iranians, not just the leadership. And therefore, I think we need to understand that and negotiate around, if we can, the current leadership, which is such an unhelpful and antipathetic one, to put it mildly. But I think we are fooling ourselves if we think that Iran will not want to develop a very significant nuclear capability. What we should try and do, and what we have been doing, at least attempting to do, is harness that in a way which will not lead to the threat of a nuclear weapon. I have quite a bit of experience of dealing with the Iranians over terrorist and hostage issues, and the current government has been, and its predecessors since 1979 have been consistently deceitful and untrustworthy to negotiate with. But I don't think there's any alternative to a Sisyphean approach. A war with Iran is not something that I think we should seriously contemplate. I think President Obama and other members of the administration are quite right not to rule anything out in public. I think it is very foolish ever to rule anything out in public. I think you should keep them feeling uneasy. But however difficult and however much there's a feeling that that President Obama's overtures to Iran were rebuffed, I think that it's important that the West and the US in particular, which given its unfortunate history over the last 30 years with Iran, should keep coming back, because the more that the Iranian people feel that their government is being the unreasonable one, the better the chance of something actually happening within that country, which must be led by Iranians and not by anyone in this country or anywhere else in the West. Yes?
I'm curious, do you foresee any changes or any road bumps in the near future as a result of the declining political and economic clout of the Western powers, particularly in, I guess, diplomatic institutions like the IMF or in negotiating talks, and the emergence of the political and economic clout of countries, particularly in the BRIC region, or the BRIC countries? I would cite the example of the role of China played in the Copenhagen talks.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see the West letting go of some of its power?
Well, I think the Copenhagen summit was extremely interesting. I mean, it's always instructive to look at failures and see what you can learn from them. You can often learn a great deal more than from looking at successes. And of course, one of the big failures or the big losers of the Copenhagen summit was the European Union, who were absolutely marginalized when it came to reaching the very minimalist agreement that was reached. The countries involved paid no attention to European interests, and this was despite the fact that whatever its other failings, Europe had actually led the intellectual discussion on climate change, but were completely incapable of rising to the negotiating challenge, and that is a matter of concern, and one that the new European Union foreign policy chief, Baroness Ashton, will have to consider very carefully. It was a brutal indication of where real power now lies in this all-important area. If Europe is simply going to be reduced to the role of being a think tank, you come up with the ideas and leave it all to us to implement or negotiate or sort out, that would be a sad development. But whether it's climate change, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's policy on Iran, it's idle to pretend that Europe is taking the lead. It isn't, and Europe had better get used to that. I haven't really addressed you originally raised Russia. Well, I think Russia is clearly too big to ignore. It is, after all, the largest geographical country in the world. It has enormous energy resources. It also happens to have a pretty grim government, and it behaves in a fairly unpredictable and aggressive way towards its neighbours, and indeed the knock-on effects are felt hundreds and hundreds of miles away in parts of Western Europe over gas supplies and things like that. I don't know where we're going to end up in 5 years' time when the current economic shockwaves have died down. I don't know whether Russia's position will rise again as the cost of energy continues to rise and they are seen as one of the major suppliers. But whereas they had a potential 5 years ago, if they'd had a more constructive government, it seems to me, to be seen as the West's favoured partner on energy, in energy areas, rather than the unstable Middle East. Their rogue-like behaviour with their neighbours seems to me rather to have vitiated that. Sorry, there was another question over there.
Yes. As you said, for symbolic reasons, it's important to have heads of state at a summit. And I can see that you wouldn't want the professional civil service diplomats doing the negotiation because the politicians can't trust them. But is it important for actual negotiation to have the head of state there instead of either some personal representative like Colonel House or some political ally like a foreign minister?
Well, I think it's what is critical is that the person who is present at the summit has the ability to carry his principle with him. And Colonel House certainly could do that with Woodrow Wilson. Henry Kissinger could do that with President Nixon because Kissinger had invented the policy in the first place. So he was always, as it were, one step ahead of his principle. That is the crucial effect. I mean, I think I can't remember what exactly the quote I used, but you must have a negotiator who cannot be contradicted by any other person, and whether the person is actually the president or prime minister or someone who has all the authority of that person is the crucial factor in all this. In old days, of course, when communications were so slow and when instructions to an ambassador or a governor in some distant part of the world were sent by ship, by a sealed dispatch and opened up, the local negotiator, ambassador, whatever it was, had to read his instructions, which would probably have been agreed and signed by the king or the secretary of state or the prime minister of the day or the president or whatever. And the amount of time that had passed between the writing of the instructions and their delivery would have been such that the circumstances on the ground had shifted substantially, which gave left an enormous amount of initiative in the hands of the local man, nearly always man, not often woman. So that era is now over, when a check can be made within seconds or minutes almost by by a phone or an email to test out a particular theory. But I do think that where someone is representing a principle at a summit, if he's known to have the absolute ear and backing of his principle, then that will do just as well. Yes, you had a question.
You mentioned the shifts between a more vertical form of governance to a horizontal form. And I was just going to ask you if you could elaborate on the positive and negative effects of those shifts and how effective your horizontal diplomacy is in leading humanitarian efforts.
Well, positives and negatives. I mean, I don't know that they can be seen quite in positive and negative ways. I mean, there's a shift, even in my career, which 40 years in diplomacy. When I entered the Foreign Office, we were largely divided up into geographical departments. Now there are still broad geographical divisions, but there are also departments dealing with climate change, human rights, nonproliferation. These are often the areas where one would want to gravitate to if you wanted to get a really interesting job. Experience in one of those horizontal areas is often seen as broader and more useful to you than now becoming a sort of a single country specialist, whether it's Iran or Russia or even China. I think there's still scope for regional geographical specialization, but there's now equally a need for specialization in some of these big issues like terrorism and nonproliferation, all the other items that I mentioned. So if you're looking at it through the lens of a young diplomat, then I think those are perhaps more exciting areas to get into. Yes?
I was wondering if you noticed over the course of your career if there's been any kind of increase in the sort of circumventing of diplomatic agreements by international businesses and non-governmental groups which are able now to move more fluidly in the international environment.
Have you got an example in mind?
Well, I was thinking sort of trade triangulation, where one state has such as the USA and Cuba, where the USA refuses to trade with Cuba, but trade can still be done by other countries in Latin America.
Yes, but I mean, there's no international agreement to ban trade with Cuba. It's a unilateral decision of the U.S. government. I think for decades, even most other Western countries, while not observing the same ban, still supped with Cuba with a very long spoon. But increasingly, I think there's been a view in other Western countries that isolating Cuba hasn't actually helped to bring about regime change in Cuba, and that maybe engaging with it more and more would be a quicker way of doing so. But circumventing international agreements, well, there are plenty of non-state actors out there who are doing their level best to circumvent international agreements. We've talked about Al-Qaeda as an egregious example. I would say the emergence of Somali pirates is another good example of that, and it's still a matter of bewilderment to those of us who wouldn't claim to be military experts of how it is possible for this country or this group of people in this country to be able to defy the combined might of the world's navies, which are often attempting to cooperate in a way which has probably never been seen before, and yet they can't deal with the problem of these Somali pirates. There was a question behind you.
Yeah, I have a question for you. If we assume that the Iranians are able to enrich uranium in sufficient quantities to go to bomb, can you talk about some of the diplomatic challenges we're going to face if and when that happens?
Well, I assume, I didn't quite hear the beginning of your question, but I mean, let me put it my way. I am 100% convinced that the present regime in Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying that's an overall wish of the Iranian people, but I'm sure that Khamenei and Ahmadinejad and that crowd are determined to develop nuclear weapons. There's no other serious explanation of why they had this secret facility, which was only discovered or only revealed relatively recently, which was completely undeclared to the International Atomic Energy Authority, which they were bound under the agreements they themselves subscribed to declare. So I take it as a given that that's what they want to do. Now, what can one do about it?
I guess what I'm trying to ask is if that happens, if they're able to actually build a device, a functional device, what will be the challenges diplomats will face, Western diplomats, moving forward as far as in the region and with Iran bilaterally or multilaterally?
Yeah. Well, the challenges we've had several examples of this, by the way. This is not, I mean, if you wind the clock back to when Pakistan and India developed nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapon capabilities, everyone made a great fuss about it at the time. Now Pakistan is our new best friend in the region. They're essential to throttle the Taliban, to keep an eye on the remnants of Al-Qaeda. I think Pakistan is a very worrying country, perhaps even more worrying than Iran, certainly as far as Britain is concerned, because we have a very large number of British people of Pakistan origin, many of whom, as we saw with the bombings of the Tube in London 5 years ago, many of whom are entirely disaffected in a way which is a very serious domestic political problem for the UK in a way which doesn't seem to be the case in the United States. There's a long historical reason why that should be so here, obviously, as an immigrant country. We eventually accepted the idea that Pakistan and India had nuclear weapons. We didn't like it. We initially imposed sanctions, then they were relaxed in the usual way. It wasn't very many years ago before the two countries nearly came to a nuclear confrontation. And the rhetoric was absolutely extraordinary. They were quite happily discussing the possibilities of millions of people dying in an exchange of nuclear weapons. I think that, so far we've been remarkably lucky when you look back on the period of time since the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan in 1945. I think it's been extraordinary that we've managed to contain the technology sufficiently to avoid another nuclear bomb being exploded. I'm quite pessimistic. I don't have an answer to you which would give you any comfort. I think, like many other problems, it will have to be managed by a combination of threats of sanctions and hopefully by the emergence of a regime in Tehran which accepts its international obligations not to be a threat to its neighbours or the wider international community. Yes?
Has there been a change in the diplomatic process or any influence in the diplomatic process affected by the citizen localness on the internet? So, and if so, what kind of change in the process has occurred?
I think it's a question of degree, not of quality. I spoke earlier about the way that democratization, I suppose, if you just fix it at around the turn of the 20th century, started to have an impact on the need, the way the rulers had to respond to the ruled. And I see the internet and things like blogging and so on as a natural development of all that, where public pressure is brought to bear on the elected. They are held increasingly accountable, and people's views are instantly transmitted. You don't need to sit around and wait, because people shower you with emails and blogs and texts. So politicians cannot say that they have a monopoly of wisdom of what is happening, or that they were blithely unaware of the concerns of the electorate. But I see that as a gradual extension of the same democratic emergence that happened around the turn of the 20th century.
And so it's changed the process in what way?
Well, I think that people that they have to be more. I think they have to respond more quickly. They have to be aware of people's concerns more quickly, and that's of course not just in foreign affairs, but in domestic affairs as well.
I see the domestic affairs. I guess I'm not sure I see it as much, other than at treaty summits or something like that, where it's clear, at least in the global climate change summits, there's a lot of influence.
Well, what about, say, opposition to the Iraq War? I mean, there were a series of nobody effectively mobilized opinion against the First World War. But by the time we get to the Iraq War, people were able to coordinate an international day of protest against the Iraq War in a way which was really possible only through internet, through modern technology, modern IT. It wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago to have carried that out as effectively. And so I think that is the sort of thing that brings pride. It didn't actually stop the war, but it certainly must have given the rulers a pause when so many millions of people were prepared to demonstrate in a coordinated way. Yes?
I have a question about semantics. Do you make a distinction between the word diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and soft power? And I guess my follow-up would be, do you see because most diplomatic histories and studies seem to be focused on political and economic issues. The whole issue of culture seems to be something that is less studied. So that's where my question is coming from.
Well, I think soft power embraces all these things. Soft power is rather a amorphous phrase, and some people now prefer to use more specific terms. Cultural diplomacy, and in that context, perhaps I could also include sport, has a long history now. I seem to remember ping pong teams going to China only nearly 40 years ago now. And so I think all these, we invest a great deal in cultural diplomacy in the UK through, again, because you're cutting across, instead of government to government, you're dealing people to people. And that's often a very effective way of breaking down barriers, avoiding misunderstandings, and creating a general climate where wars and confrontation are very much more difficult, where where the general public are sympathetic to and feel empathy with the other community. It's very hard, I think, for even the most obdurate of governments to persist in that. I think, if the Iranian government were ever to weaken sufficiently so that regular exchanges took place between at a cultural level, I think that would do enormous good in terms of US-Iranian relations. But at the moment, the climate is quite poisoned by the Iranian response to their own dissidents.
We have time for one last question. Anybody have a brilliant comment? Here we go.
Can you explain to me why it would be worse for the U.S. to go to war with Iran than for Iran to get a nuclear weapon?
Well, for Iran to... let me...
It's like you thought war is an absolutely not an option.
Oh, no, I don't say it's not an option, but I think it's the worst of the available options.
So it's worse than Iran getting a weapon?
Yes.
Why
Yeah.
do you think that?
Well, because a war, Machiavelli once said, you may start a war when you wish, you may not end it when you please. And I think that's one of the wisest comments that even Machiavelli made, and he's got quite a lot of them, though again, he's not regarded as everyone's cup of tea. But I think the law of unintended consequences kicks in very rapidly once you go to war. And for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, however undesirable that may be, gives them a potential. It doesn't actually bring about anything necessarily other than that capability. I think it's very bad that Pakistan has a nuclear weapon. I think it's very bad that Iran has a nuclear weapon. I would be perfectly happy, personally, for Britain and France to give up nuclear weapons. I don't think that will happen, at least not in the foreseeable future, although the START talks that were successful, was it only yesterday? I think, will put some pressure on Britain and France. I cannot see any circumstances in which Britain would need a unilateral nuclear weapon. I just can't see it. But I am, of course, worried by rogue states like Iran having nuclear weapons, and I'm also concerned, thanks to the activities of Mr. A.Q. Khan of Pakistan, of the possibility of nuclear technology, nuclear weapon technology falling into the hands of terrorist groups. And that seems to me a much more worrying development than a state like Iran having it. But again, I don't think any of these things are good. I think they're all bad. I'm just trying to see how one manages bad situations. Most of my career I've been managing bad situations, and anyone can manage easy situations.
Thank you very much.